Hi, Critical Practice viewers. Today I wanted to discuss with you a concept and a discipline known as disability studies. But before we start to get into that, let me introduce myself. My name is Mike Selck. I'm an undergraduate here at Southern Illinois University. I'm a senior, graduating this year, hopefully. And my primary major is in rhetoric and persuasion. So for me, I come to disability studies with a unique perspective, certainly, that focuses a lot on language and what the rhetoric surrounding disability does and means, etc. So I come from a very specific area around disability studies, but I'm going to try my best within this presentation to get interdisciplinary to discuss some different ways that disability studies are approached. And at the end, hopefully, I'll be able to reference some sites or some sources that will be able to probably offer better perspectives on some of the other disciplines that I'm not as familiar with on the notion of disability studies. So let's go ahead and get into it. What does disability studies mean? And I want to start off, and I'm going to start off very slowly before I just throw something out there by saying that disability studies is a very, very complex relationship. And it is so complex and balanced because it has to hold two tenets really simultaneously. It has to hold both the individual perspective and the social construction in a unique balance. They have to hold individual perspectives and social perspectives in a very unique flux. And what I mean by that is to say that if we are told as a fundamental arm or tenet of disability studies that disability is a social construct, we have to be able to recognize individual experiences, what those experiences are, and also recognize how they are informed and why we consider them disabled. So here's what I mean. If we hold then that disability studies is a social construct, there are questions that arise automatically. And these questions take a form of how. How is disability studies a social construction? How is disability similar to race and gender, other social constructs that we might have encountered? And what is it about my rhetoric or my language choice uniquely that is responsible for the existence of a disability? And these are tough questions. And the reason that right now we are automatically confused by that question is because we don't have yet a definition for what disability truly is. And so let's go there now because this will help clarify this balance a little bit. And so although I won't be citing that many authors throughout the entirety of this presentation, I will cite one here to be able to help me currently inform my conversation about what a disability is. So this is one of the first definitions that I came to when I began getting into the field and trying to increase my scholarship on disability. And it's been time tested for me. I continue to go back to it and rework with it, et cetera, and find the problems and the goals, et cetera. But here ultimately is it from Disabled Persons International that operates as a multinational organization advocating for rights of disabled bodies. I pull this from their website specifically on a part titled "The Constitution." Their argument here is really what is supposed to be a universal constitution for international types of organizations to adopt to address and inform their capability with disabled bodies. So here's what Disabled Persons International has to say about what a disability is. There are two parts. The first part is the part that will look more at impairment. And I'll discuss what I mean by that after. So, the first part of this definition says that disability is the functional limitation within the individual caused by physical, mental, or sensory impairment. Now, what this means is most often correlated to what we might normally think of when we hear disability. When we hear the term or disability, we think of physical manifestations, right? Disabilities maybe that we can see or we become incredibly aware of because of a physical impairment or a mental or sensory impairment. And this is interesting because this is the part of the definition that will take individual experiences very closely, and it'll take them to mean that disability is also there is also a biological element, right, to disability. And this is different than some other areas of study because in other areas of study, like in studies about race, we tend to step back from the studies originally conducted that said there is a biological element to race. And we do that because some of these studies were conducted in a light to be able to prove the inferiority of bodies of color. And so oftentimes these studies trying to prove a biological element and things like gender or in things like race fall on problematic pretenses. In disability studies, we exist in this constant flux where that biological element is understood, and although it might not be necessary, it is held as a part of individual experiences because individual bodies that have disabilities, in this sense, have impairments, experience unique social conditions, physical conditions such as pain or social uncomfort, stigma, and oppression, even. And so these things are unique to individual bodies, but also are informed from a particular location. And what I mean by that brings us to the second part of the definition of disability. So the second part of disability and the definition of it is that disability as the loss or limitation of opportunities to take part in the normal life of the community on an equal level with others due to physical or social barriers. Now, this part of the definition starts to inform how we think of the first part of the definition, right? If we hold that the first part of the definition informs our sort of like medical understanding of disability, that there is a physical, mental, or sensory impairment, then the second part of the definition is absolutely necessary because it informs us as to why those conditions or impairments are relevant or important. Let me qualify this. Let's think about desks. It can either be in a classroom or in an office or wherever desks are present, really. Desks are not created equal. And what I mean by that is that we would like to believe maybe there is a large national survey about the types of bodies that will be using desks and how we could potentially design the best desk to accommodate all bodies. And that is simply not the case. Thinking about this further, to really reveal physical and social barriers, what I mean is that the desks maybe that I most often see in my classrooms, for example, are built in a very particular form, right? And so the questions that should arise is, does the form suit all bodies equally and universally? And the answer to that question should undoubtedly be no, right? The desks in their form are built with a specific weight limit, with a specific type of seating angle, back angle, etc. And while these things might seem accidental, it is a tenet of disability studies to say that really this is not accidental. This is a unique form of able-bodiedness being displayed. To understand that these able-bodieds can conform and adapt quite easily to the situations and surroundings around them. So let's use another example. I'll try and end my vendetta against the desks. Let's talk about buildings, right? So thinking about buildings and society's construction of buildings, etc., think about why all buildings are not disability accessible. And when thinking about this fact, we start to reveal some of the vestiges of the second definition of disability, which is the physical and social barriers. So if buildings are uniquely constructed in a manner that does not privilege the accessibility of disabled bodies, there exists not only a physical barrier, but also a social barrier that indicates that those bodies are not welcome in that building. And so I'd like to think about this in a broad spectrum. So let's not just think about buildings that don't have wheelchair ramps or elevators. In a broad sense, this could mean buildings that use one type of lighting, understanding that different variants of lighting can be more suited for individuals with different levels of visibility and eyesight, understanding blindness as a disability and a social construction about what the importance of blindness is and why blindness matters, understanding that, like in classrooms specifically, that Braille should be present to signify not only location, but also direction, etc. And thinking about a large topic where quite some study has been done is in disability accessible restrooms, and the not only advent but also appearance of these restrooms. These restrooms with often more space and handrails, etc. And when thinking about these types of conditions, think about the buildings that you might enter on a daily basis and whether or not all of these tenants are offered, and whether or not these physical and social barriers exist. And I am inclined to believe that you might notice some elements of able-bodiedness automatically being privileged. But let's move on a little bit, because I think now that we have a grasp of the social construction of disability, we can talk about the oppression. And identifying the oppression is truly key here. And this is also hard to do because there are so many different terms. So I will narrow this part of the presentation down to two particular terms that I feel get used most often, acknowledging the fact that I think there are many more. and I will also inform the particular vernacular that I choose to use maybe for the rest of this presentation. So identifying the oppression is critical, and we'll say the oppressions exist with names such as disableism and ableism, or both and ableism. And there's nothing I find really mutually exclusive about the terms, but there are plenty of arguments out there about why one term should be preferenced over the other. I will inform my decision to use the term disableism now. I use the term disableism to identify the oppression of disabled bodies for a very specific reason. And this argument is not super long and definitely not exhaustive, but this argument is that the term ableism to identify oppression is a rhetorical device about oppression linked to ability. And while that might seem like it is certainly the goal and intent that disability studies aims to combat, truly what I find at least this branch of disability studies aiming to combat is perceived questions of ability. And so ableism focuses on discrimination and oppression based on ability. Disableism, for me, informs discrimination and oppression societally, culturally, even behaviorally, based on the perceived adherence to a form of disability. And what I mean by that is, I think that there is also oppression tied into our narratives and tied into our large societal understandings of disability that is not always uniquely tied to just ability. And I think that will be most of the understanding that I'll do about these terms. Understanding also simultaneously that I don't think there has to be a hierarchy. In fact, that could be quite counterproductive to being able to truly identify these oppressions in the future. But I'm always open and receptible to thoughts and feedback about these terms and identifying the oppressions. And I like to be able to at least make my argument or make my case for why I use this particular vernacular. It is also important to note, I suppose, that the term that I use emerges out of more specific geographical locations. So disableism is used more in Europe to be able to understand disability oppression, whereas ableism is used a little bit more in the United States. And these two areas are certainly not the pinnacle or exhaustive areas of research for disability studies. And there are also, like I had mentioned, many different terms, but this seems to be the geographical locations where the terms come about. And so I guess that's super British of me to say disableism. But this is just where my introduction to disability studies sort of came in, understanding and hearing this term. And so that's where I choose my vernacular. But let's move on. Now that we've identified the oppression, let's talk about this social construction a little bit more, because this concept might still be rattling around. And now that we've identified the oppression, let's talk about unique perspectives. Perspective one will be titled the social barriers approach. And this is the one that I most commonly am associated with, thinking about language and disability as a social construction, really comes from this approach. And so thinking about the social barriers approach, we'll see some examples like we might have seen or heard before. And so individual models, like the medical model that we referenced earlier, hold that a body becomes disabled because of the presence of impairment, right? An example, or for instance, my dad had to use a wheelchair because of the presence of multiple sclerosis in his body. And the medical model would indicate that my dad's body was disabled because he had MS and used a wheelchair. All right, the appearance or existence of that biological element is enough, as the medical model is concerned, to connotate disability or to designate disability. And so, conversely, the social barriers approach holds that socially constructed barriers have disabled people with perceived impairments. And so notice the word disabled here is used as a verb. Um, and that's interesting because it holds that it is social constructions that are actually disabling bodies that have impairments. For instance, the reason that all buildings are not wheelchair accessible is because of the social construction and prevailing narrative of disabled bodies as docile and immobile. This is also historically rooted. If we think about laws that used to exist within the United States that are sort of generally known as ugly laws, we reveal some of this social and physical barrier. So, ugly laws within the United States held that, this is the vernacular of many of these laws, that the physical appearance or visibility of a deformity or a disease would bar the individual representing those factors from actually participating within civic space or public domain. And so, if we think about the implications of this, we think about the lack of public transportation, public sidewalks, really everything that is held to be public and civic um, would be essentially banned for those individuals representing a disability. And that specific type of social construction is what leads a trajectory of disablism to continue now, because many of these laws have been repealed, and enforcement for those types of laws, varied for a while. But maybe the last one of those laws, those ugly laws that existed within the United States, had been repealed only 10 years ago, and that's fairly shocking thinking about the year that we're in now. But it's incredibly relevant to think about, although those laws are disappearing, what is the status of, at least the United States, where I'm speaking from, what is the status of disabled bodies and visibility within public space? And also, let's certainly not mark the advent of or the presence of disabled bodies in public space as having overcome disablism. Certainly not. And while it might hint to some progress and to some adaptation, to some evolution, it certainly does not mark an end to this rigorous area of study. So, after thinking about that social barriers approach, now that I've gone there, I would like to take it a little further. And now that I have you thinking about how this social framework is sort of good or good enough to be able to think about disability, I'd like to interrogate a tenet of that social barriers approach that talks about visibility and perception. Because if we think about it, we've truly been making arguments this entire time about not wanting to universalize not only terms but also conditions and notions like visibility and perception. We wouldn't want to create an area of study where we say that disability is socially constructed because of the visibility of disabilities, and that is because not all bodies experience visibility or sightedness or perception the same. And so, taking that a little bit further, we'll introduce a concept that is another part of disability studies that is a little easier to grasp. That is, not all disabilities are visible. And it is because of that fact, and given that fact, the social barriers approach is concerned with social construction based on perception. What do social barriers do to disabilities that are not visible? And this is interesting to think about given that large narratives about disabilities that are not visible continue to exist. So there must be something more than the social barriers approach informing our understandings. And what takes this social approach a little bit further and really investigates disability studies as a whole is understanding that these narratives, these rethinkings and retellings are incredibly fluid. And what I mean by that is diverse, coming from different angles and trajectories. And it is because of that that oftentimes perceived characteristics of a disability are used to be able to create large narratives about what that disability actually is or maintains. And that's what informs questions of ability. So large social constructions or understandings about what multiple sclerosis is, for instance, then informs a large either public and medical discourse and conversation about what happens to your body automatically whenever you get multiple sclerosis or whenever you get any disease really or any disability. They try to set up these sort of prescriptive types of understandings that all bodies will fall into similar formats, and that this is where social barriers goes a little bit further. It is to trouble those notions of universality or of universal natures, and to say truly that all bodies will experience these tenets, harms, and oppressions differently. And holding that concept helps us really reveal why disability studies can be so useful. And so, finally, and in conclusion, I'd like to leave with not all doom and gloom, and maybe one potential or hopeful avenue to be able to combat disableism or oppression in our lives. And this concept comes out of another tenet of disability studies that understands time, our relationship to time, our body throughout time, and temporality. And so this tenet that I'd like to present that is referred to often as temporary able-bodiedness becomes really, really important as a type of political strategy and an identity, really. And what this means is, and although this part will certainly sound gloomy, I promise it's not, hopefully. And what this means is our bodies will not exist in the current state that they are in for infinity. There's at this time and place, technologically at least, before we get into those conversations, it does not exist. Our bodies age, and it is because of that fact that all bodies actually experience temporary able-bodiedness. And holding this condition, for me, helps inform a specific type of not only political strategy, but also of writing, of feeling, of emotion, and etc. And so understanding that fundamental inevitability helps me think of empathy. And I like to think of empathy not as an emotion, but as a tactic and as a strategy, even a political strategy. So when we think about empathy, we think about the difference between empathy and sympathy, either sympathy, feeling sorry for somebody, maybe in this case feeling sorry for somebody because they have a disability, versus empathy, which is understanding the conditions that go into that disability in your personal life. Yeah, so often you hear the phrase, walk a mile in my shoes, or ironically, my dad would always say, like roll a mile in my chair. Um, so thinking about those things help reveal empathy as a strategy. Understanding our bodies will not always continue to exist the way that they are now means that we have a responsibility to be able to think about the ways that our bodies will be uniquely affected in the future. And if we can start thinking about our bodies that way, hopefully we would be able to think about other bodies in a similar fashion. And this does not mean that we have to think about all bodies as experiencing the same level of disability. It means that we recognize difference, recognize that all bodies will achieve and will have unique experience with varying degrees and vast different levels of trajectories, etc. And by understanding that difference, we can understand different and unique ways to be able to approach things like our politics, our social engagements, even our cultures or our individual identities. So understanding that is very helpful, at least for me, in my writings and my studies about disability, because I aim to achieve truly something that is larger than just the individual or just my individual body. And in that sense, being able to embrace empathy as a strategy might mean that my writings, or my retellings, etc., my embracing temporary able-bodiedness could potentially help resolve some of these questions of oppression and this disableism in the future. So that largely concludes this presentation on disability studies. I hope I haven't confused you too much. I'm more than welcome for comments, replies, and I'd love to be able to talk to anybody about the content of this presentation. So feel free to be able to get in contact with me. My email is Mike, M-I-K-E, .selck, S-E-L-C-K, at gmail.com. And I hope that Critical Praxis viewers really enjoyed this presentation, as well as I hope you could pass this on to anybody really in this area of study to be able to combat desks, I guess. But thank you all for tuning in.